Welcome! On this series we're going to look at React hooks. React hooks are key to any React applications that is going to work with functional components. And in this introductory lesson we are going to look at a couple of basic hooks. So first of all, what are React hooks? Basically, React hooks are functions that allow you to hook into the React state and lifecycle of a functional component. Hooks facilitate the access and management of a React state, the props, the contents, and its lifecycle. It's like a way that React is like an API that React exposes for functional components to interact with its native capabilities. Hooks can be used freely, and you are completely free to use them as you wish, but there are a couple of rules that you need to be aware of if you want to implement React hooks. The first rule is that we're looking to is that all hooks need to be declared at the top level of your functional component. What that means is that React hooks need to be defined before any data manipulation or any function declaration or any early return that you may have or condition. That is because React hooks define and interact with the state, so if you want to later use them, you need to make sure that they're defined at the top level. And the second rule to take into account is that React hooks can only be used and declared within a React function. That means that that you will be working with React functional components. If you use React classes, that is not going to be a tool available to you, because React classes have their own lifecycle methods to interact with the lifecycle of a component. As well, if you try to declare a React hook within a JavaScript function, that is not going to work. React hooks only work with React functions or custom hooks that you might define yourself. So with these couple of rules, let's see which are the couple of React hooks that we are going to be looking at today. The first one is useState, and the second one will be useEffect. The first one, useState, basically is a React hook that allows functional components to set a local state for their components. A local state means that the value will be preserved between component renders, and is a value that is going to be persistent throughout the lifecycle of that component. That value can be then accessed from the component's functions or a JS template syntax, that is the HTML. You can apply modifications to that state as well as reading the content of it. When you define the useState hook, it will accept a default parameter. That means that when you initialize a new state, you passed in the default parameter that you want that state to have. In return, React is going to give you back a pair. The first one is a state reference that is going to host the default value, and the second one is a function that you can use to update the state. The difference in updating the state between React class components and React functional components is that when classes update the state, they update the full object and the full reference to the full state, whereas in functional components, what you are updating is a reference to that state. This is going to make sense in a second. React functional components can have multiple useState hooks. That way you can have multiple references to different values of a state. And they work, React useState hooks work perfectly well with destructing assignment syntax, which is an addition to JavaScript recently, which is really useful to work with destructing and returning values into individual variables. This is an example that we are going to look at. For example, The first line of this script is going to define a new state variable, and it's going to be using the useState hook and passing in the true value. This means that we are creating a new state reference with true as a default. This state reference is going to be host on the active variable. And then the second value of the returning values that useState returns is a function that you can use to update the state. As we've seen, a component can have multiple references to the useState hook. And the second line, what is creating is a state variable of type string, which by default has a string value of user, and the value is stored under the name variable. The second function, the setName variable, is a function that you can use to update this value here. So if you later on want to change the username from user to another string, you should call the setName. Lastly, if we look into the last line, so we have the set active to false, meaning that we are updating the first reference to the state via this method, this function here. So if by default the active was true, now after this line the active will be false. So this is all for the useState. We're going to look more into the useState later on, but for now let's look at the useEffect as well. So useEffect is a React hook that allows you to run logic after the component has been rendered. That means that you can fetch data from an API or interact with external calls, manage subscriptions, or apply any DOM modifications that you want to apply after the component has rendered. This is really useful for executing this type of logic, which from React's perspective, they are called effects. That is why the hook is called useEffect. When you work with useEffects, the callback method allows you to define and to access the component's state and the component's props, because at the end of the day you are within the component. So when a component re-renders, you need to keep in mind that the useEffect will also be rendered, unless you scope the useEffect into a specific scope. So for example, you can define that I will only want my useEffect to execute when a certain variable changes. That way, any changes that the component may have will not trigger the useEffect. You can also say the opposite. I want my useEffect to always be triggered when the component renders. That way, you can play and with the scope of the useState as your component requires. The useEffect allows you to specify returning functions that manage the unsubscription of the useEffect, as well as cleaning any data that you might have. For example, if you create a loop or create an interval, you can later on unsubscribe when the component unmounts. And then finally, as well as the useState hook, the useEffect, there can be also multiple useEffect hooks within a component. On this snippet down below, we can see an example of how a React developer is going to use a useEffect. The first parameter of the useEffect is the callback method that is going to be executed once, in this case, the active variable changes. This useEffect here has a scope of active, meaning that only when this variable changes, let's go back again. So when this variable changes, the callback is going to be executed. So this function here is going to be performed. This value here can also be undefined. when this value is undefined, means that the useEffect is going to be executed right after component finalizes their execution and their initialization, or anytime there is a re-render of React. So this has been the introduction of these concepts, a bit of a concept lesson, and we are going to apply this into a real project. We're going to build a COVID analytics tools, and it will be a tool that it will show us the list of countries and the actual analytics of the COVID impact per each of these countries around the globe. I think it's an interesting tool to build and especially put into practice the concept that we've been reviewing. So to do so, we're going to use a React application. We're going to be based on the Nestline theme framework, which is a CSS framework that can be used to quickly build UIs. So we are not going to be focused on the actual user interface and the styling, but more on the React side of it. And to gather data from, we're going to use the Rapid API marketplace, which offers a set of APIs that you can use as a backend. It's for this case, we're going to use the COVID-19 tracking, which is a free API that grabs live coronavirus statistics. And yeah, this is the information that we're going to be fetching from. So there's a list of countries. We have the cases per country, new cases, deaths, and recoveries, active cases, and all this information is going to be given to us by this API. It's a free API. You just need to sign up if you're not a user yet. It's free, and the pricing for this API as well is free. I think you have up to 10,000 calls per month to the endpoints. So for a testing purposes, more than enough. And I think it will also work for small projects if you have one. I really recommend this marketplace. Is really great tool to work with. And yeah, so if we look into the React project we are going to be working today, I've already created the project myself. I've created the project using the npm-x create the React app. That way all the files are already in place. And I've been playing around with the files and my project right now have a header component, a navigation, and the actual content. I will start the node server now so we can look at what is the files and how the project looks like, and then what we are going to build. So as I said, we have our header on the top, a navigation, which right now only hosts a couple of items. The first one would be a list of all the countries, and then I've added a second tab where the idea is that from all the list of countries that are on the world, you will be able to add which are your favorites ones, so you have an easy access to your favorites and be able to see the analytics of only those countries that you have marked as favorite. But for now we're going to work on the all countries. We're going to apply the useEffect and useState. And yeah, without further ado, let's go and create this. So one of the first things that we want to implement are we're going to first start with the useState. We have this application component, which is the parent with which has the header, navigation, and the content component as a child. For now, we're going to make a table that is going to accept the list of countries, and this table is going to live in content. The actual data fetching, though, it's not going to be managed by the content component, but from the application itself. So the application component is going to have the list of countries and is going to pass that value down into the content. So how do we manage the actual list of countries? Using the useState. We need to define a state for the function, for the application functional component, and this useState will be an array, and in this array we're going to have the list of countries that are going to be shown on the table. So if we look at our useState effect, by default we will have an empty array, and as we've seen, there are a couple of returning values to this. So we will have countries and update countries. The first one is going to handle the actual countries to show, and the second one would be a function that we can use to update the state. And then useState is already here, and we also have the useEffect. So we will start with an empty array and then implement the actual fetching with the useEffect, but for now let's pass this down into the content. Content needs to receive the props of the countries, so we'll create an interface, a couple of interfaces for managing that. The first interface will be the actual interface for the content, for the content component, and the second interface we want to export is how the returning values of the countries look like. So it will be interface of a country, because basically our content component will have countries, which will be an array of countries. And this will have our content. So we've seen our content component is going to receive an array of countries, and our array of countries will be also it will also have an interface. So we're going to check how the response sample looks like. If we open up this, we see that we will be getting back around 200 countries, and per each country this will be the actual data per each country. So for example, we'll have a country text. I think we can copy this and we'll place that here. And then we can go and see this would be a string, because all of them will be a string really. Okay, so this is how my interface of countries will look like and my array. Now we can go back and actually pass in my countries, which will be my countries up here, and the useState we will also give them the actual data type, because this project is based on TypeScript, so it's always important to type as much as you can. In this case would be the interface of country, and to begin with, we're going to give some data here, so at least a couple of countries just to make sure that you are able to get them. It will be first of all a placeholder values, but this will help us to know that we are on a good we are building the application as it is expected, and later on we will fetch this data from the API. So if we quickly go here, I'm just going to copy, for example, my Italy. So if we copy this and place it here, so this is how Italy looks like, and then we also have UK, for example. Just a couple to set up the listing. Okay, now that we have this, what I've done is set the default state for the countries to have these two countries here. That way we are not required to fetch data from the API yet in order to have this data shown on the screen. Because right now the useState have set this as default, and we have the countries here. We haven't updated the countries yet, but these countries is now passed in the content, and if we go into content, we can list them here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to loop through all these countries that we receive, and we are going to show their name and, for example, the number of cases of COVID that each country have. So let's create a new function, get countries, and this function can be like this. We will have a UL, and we can say that we're going to get the countries. And my get countries, yeah, it's complaining from the ANI. We are going to get my props, with it will be countries, and basically this will just loop through all the countries, and it's going to map them and return me the country. Let's say country, let's put the country name for now, so country text, and we need this, actually this, I want to put in a couple of lines. So if we save this and we go back to application, we now should see a couple of countries, Italy and UK. Okay, so now we have Italy and we have UK. There's a couple of things to notice here. First of all, our useState is working, so we've defined the state of the application component, and as we've seen, we can pass down the state to a child component. So this is the power of the React hooks. If from this component I try to update this and replace countries by another value, this will not update the actual application state because we haven't passed down the actual function to update the state. So it's always good practice, if you need to update this state, use this, because otherwise that will lead to some errors. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is, instead of just showing this UL here, we're going to create a table for them. And to create the table, we're going to be based on this Nestline framework, and I'm going to use this table over here. If we look at the DOM, this is quite, we can just quickly copy paste this. And so we need a new section. Let's quickly create a table, and table is going to be component. table small, and this will have a one header and the actual content. I think we can easily copy paste this. And then let's add this to class name, because otherwise React is going to complain. And yeah, this is going to show us the header, and we need to decide now which data we want to show on the table. I think we can go with the country name, active cases, and then we can go with total deaths. And yeah, let's put some light to it and put as well recovered ones. Try to be not that depressive. Hopefully recovered one is much higher than that. Okay, so this will give us the table we are looking for. Okay, so we have name, active cases, deaths, recovered. Now let's add each individual one. If we look into this, we can see that the content align looks like this. And as we already have our countries here, we can just call get countries here. And the countries, instead of LE, what is going to return back is this. And that should be class name. So as you see, like right now, we are not getting too much into React hooks, but I think it's important for visualization to have this. Okay, so now that we have, let's put this a bit more cleaner. All right, so here we need to paste the country name, and that would be country text. Second one we said was active cases, so we have active cases as well, and then deaths and recovers. So country, total deaths, and then country, total recovered. If we go back, we should be seeing, okay, there's some error. Okay, we're returning. Oh, because yeah, we are mapping the country. Oh, okay, that is it. I think there's an error here. Oh, we need the props. Yeah, any loop needs an index and have the key. Okay, now this shouldn't complain. Okay, cool. So here we are, Italy with 99,000 cases, almost 100. UK with more active cases, but less deaths. And recovered, no information for UK, and 82,000 recovered for Italy. So Now that we have the table, we can go and look at the second hook that we discussed today, and that would be the useEffect. If we go back to application, right now we are using a useState, and the useState is defining a couple of countries by default, and those are the ones that are listing. But those are hard code on the code. What we need them is we want to get them from the API. So basically, once our functional application component loads, we want to fetch data from the API. We want to receive the list of countries, and then we want to update the state. We want to update the countries, and we will put there the information that the backend give us. The front end should not care about which data and the values of it. So it's just a manager that receives data and outputs on the UI. So to do so, we will use the useEffect. As we've seen, the useEffect allows us to fetch data from API or establish certain subscriptions to external services. In this case, we're going to use the Rapid API. I've created a utils folder with the constant files. This is where the URL of the API is going to be stored, as well as the key. This key is unique, and you need to change it from your Rapid API dashboard. This is a placeholder key. You can revoke as many times as you want, and the previous keys won't work. So make sure that you update your key, and then you have your host. This is the actual API. Key and host need to be on the actual headers, and the URL is the actual endpoint that you're hitting. So how can we do this? So first of all, we're going to declare our useEffect, and this is going to be our React hook. And when we want of this is want to execute a callback, and the execution of this callback, I want it to be when the component renders the first time, and in any other re-renders that it has. So anytime that this component renders, I want to call the API and get the latest data. If I wanted to scope this, I could add a variable here, and this useEffect will only get triggered when that value changes. But for now, as we want to be triggered and at any time, we will leave it as is. It's important to notice that as we are going to be working with asynchronous code here, we're going to fetch API. However, you cannot directly assign an asynchronous React callback. This is not compatible with the effect callback expected by React. So one workaround to do this is we will need to create an asynchronous function and manually call it from within the effect. To call the API, there are several libraries that you can use from React. From my case, and for the sake of this video, we're going to use plain JavaScript. So we're going to use the fetch pipeline, which is basically an HTML pipeline that JavaScript provides by natively. So by default, you will be able to interact with it, and it's quite simple. If we scroll a bit down below, we see an example of how to implement this. We will using async as well as some promises. So let's do it. So first of all, we need to create our function. So that will be get countries, and this will be an async. Not here. So this is an async method, well, function, and within this async, we're going to await for the fetch to happen. And then fetch, as you've seen, it takes a couple of properties. The first one is the URL, and the second one is the actual properties of this call. The URL is going to be coming from our constants, So we need to import the API. Oh, here we have it. So this is the constant that's going to have my URL. And on the properties, we have, I think it's called host. No, let's check. Yeah, method. It's going to be a get call. And we also want to add some headers, because if we look into our Rapid API and code snippet, we see that we are required to set this couple of headers. So we will need our key and our host. So our headers would be, let's see, how is it called? X Rapid API key. Let's copy this. Here's going to be placed my key, and then we also have our host, which will be our host. And this I've already set up on the constants. So we can go API key and API.host. Okay, so once we define our fetch, we can say that our returning value would be, oh, we need to define as well our response. We save the response, and then we return response.json, which is it's going to be parsed. The response is going to be parsed by the fetch interface, so we don't need to care about this. And then, as I said, useEffect is not asynchronous by default, and it doesn't accept an asynchronous function, so we need to manually call this get countries, and we will treat that as a promise. So then we can say that our data that comes back, this data is actually will be the countries. So I can update this and say that I want this to be update countries. So as we've seen, we are using update countries within a useEffect. So we are on a React hook, which is a useEffect, and we are updating the countries state, which is defined by another React hook, which is the useState. So here we can see the relationship between useState and useEffect, and the power of this. useState is going to define the state of the component, and the useEffect is going to be used to update. So without further ado, let's save this and let's see what are we getting. Okay, so if we load the application, we see that all our countries are already been listing here. All this data is coming from the API. If we inspect and we check the network and we reload again, we see that there's a call to the COVID-19 API, and our response, we are getting the list of countries. And this is exactly what is getting listed here. Okay, so I think we've seen, maybe the last thing to do would be to remove this, because we no longer need countries hard-coded. And if we save and go back, everything stays the same. So yeah, I think for today this will be all. We've seen the useEffect and as well as the useState. How is the relation between them? How can we pass from a functional component to another functional component and share the state between the two components? How can we fetch data from an API? And in the next video, I think we will be focusing on adding some favorites, because that would also give us opportunity to dip a bit more on the React hooks, and we will be looking to create some custom React hooks as well. So hopefully you learn something new today, and maybe I will see you around.